Now, I had a great pleasure of meeting Josh and Lisa last night, but this is an idea. Josh, how did you end up in such a cushy job that you've gotten right now?
Inherited wealth. I went to university in Boston, and I actually had the best fake ID in the dorm, so I was the designated booze buyer. And there was a really wonderful shop not far from my college, and just when they're buying the beer and buying the liquor, the wine department was very interesting, and they happened to have a really, really good salesman. People were talking earlier about tastemakers. This one guy's name is Tom Schmeiser, and it's a shop called, it was called Macy's, and now it's called Marty's. And if any of you guys have done business in Boston, you probably have dealt with them. And I just got sucked in. I loved the history, the stories, the people. I also liked the fact that every year it changed, and you basically had to regroup and start all over again, and the variety fascinated me. So anyway, I wound up working in retail after college, and then I went and worked a couple of years in Burgundy with a small winery where I was basically a slave, but that was fun. And then I worked for an importer for about 13 years across the country and started writing 12 years ago. So it was mainly it was the people and the variety and the fact that the further you went in, the more there was to know, and it's just this endless rabbit hole of information, and I love that.
Okay. It's not because you've got a drinking problem or anything like that.
Oh, of course I do. But
but you've solved that problem. Yes. I'll just turn this microphone on. Okay, Lisa, what's your story?
Oh gosh, I think most people totally fall into wine. I definitely did that. I studied English Lit and Performing Arts at college and wound up going to London to study Shakespeare for a year. Completely fell in love with London. And then after I graduated from college, went back there to become a playwright. Was a struggling playwright for a year or so and got a few plays produced on the Fringe, and then decided I actually needed to get a job that paid some money. And went to a friend of mine who was managing a wine bar at the time in Pimlico in London, and he said, come and work here. I knew nothing about wine. In fact, I was more of a JD and Coke drinker at the time. But anyway, so I was having fun working at the wine bar, and then my friend, the manager, was leaving. And the owners, who were based out in Dorset, came to me and said, would you be interested in the job? You've got a college degree. Do you know about wine? And I said, yeah. Because the job came with a wonderful apartment just over it, in the middle of Pimlico.
So that was the reason why you fibbed?
Yeah. But then I signed up like the next day for WSET classes in London and totally fell in love with it, and then never looked back.
Okay. Well, from last night, I can see that Jennifer, Lisa, and Josh got along fantastically well. But you did listen to Jennifer's presentation. At any point in time along the way, did you think to yourself, well, that might be the observation, but I don't see it that way? Lisa?
I was just mentioning to Jennifer one of the most curious things, because I have to say I was absolutely fascinated by all of that data. And much of that data that was coming out there maps very closely with what we see at the Wine Advocate from our subscriber base and what we know about our own subscribers. But there were a couple of things that really sort of stood out to me. And one of the interesting ones, and one of my favorite slides, was the slides that compared what American consumers thought of Australian wines compared to other major regions. And I think you had California on there, France, and Italy. And one of the things that stood out for me was how the most American consumers thought California was 87% innovative. when for me, knowing Australian wines as well as I do, for here, this is like the center of innovation for me when it comes to, what's happening in the wine industry. And what I know about California wines and Napa, Sonoma in particular, and how they're produced is much more sort of traditional. Whereas, if U.S. consumers track, California as being innovative, and that's a good thing, obviously, because they love buying California wines, then there's something that can be done there in terms of what Australia puts itself out as, as being leaders in terms of innovation when it comes to grape growing, winemaking, but also trends as well. Some of the trends that you see coming out of Australia in terms of high quality wines, and right now I'm thinking about the Chardonnays that could do so much better in the American market right now, and leaders in innovation in terms of, because, Americans are very trend conscious as well, is certainly one direction to go.
But how would you get a message like that out, that we're great innovators, and as consumers, why do I care about that?
Well, one of the problems I think that we saw with all of the information that was coming out about U.S. consumers is that they still seem to perceive Australian wine as one style. Big, bold, juicy Australian Shiraz. And whereas we know that that's just, one very, very, important part of the style palette that Australia provides, when you consider some of the incredible Pinot Noirs, Chardonnays, Rieslings, the GSMs that probably don't get the recognition that they should, and the Grenaches in general coming out of Australia. So it's really, I think, a little bit more about demonstrating the versatility, the incredible size of Australia, the amount of terroirs that are available here, the amount of climates that are available here. I mean, again, I think Americans have this idea that, there's just one climate and it's hot and sunny all the time here. And that's okay, but that's not all of the regions. And we've seen a move towards Tasmania recently, cooler climate areas, even areas like Great Southern, where you'll be able to produce wines of great elegance and finesse. And, with all of that innovation coming in there to bring about a totally unique Australian expression of those grape varieties that, stand right up there alongside of the greatest in the world. It's really about getting that story out there as well.
Josh, you were obviously listening to Jennifer. Was there anything there that you thought either you didn't agree with, or you thought needs to be even emphasised as being critically important for the people in this room?
Well, for example, you cite Nielsen, and was it every 2 years they come out, or 4 years, and they just came out the recent survey of consumers in America and alcohol in general, and the generation now that's, say, between 20 and 30, as far as their drinking habits, they are, I'd call it very disloyal, or small C Catholic. They drink everything and anything. They're very brand disloyal, which is a complete change from previous generation. Let's call it the post-Depression generation. I was born in '62. Father was born in '38. Mother in '40. That generation was very brand conscious. I mean, so for example, if you were a Budweiser drinker, you drank Budweiser. A family was a Ford family, or they were a Chevy family, and never the twain shall meet. I mean, that's what you did. Budweiser was your drink, wine, this and that. The next generation that's coming up, basically, they're open to anything. I have a 21-year-old daughter who's in college, and her friends, I mean, literally, they drink everything from bag in a box to dropping $15 on a bottle of beer, and everything in between. So I'd say the sky's the limit in terms of that. The one thing I really like the topic of distribution. I think for a lot of people in the room here, if you want to get in the American market, you're probably going to have to wind up figuring out a way to self-distribute, because it's shrinking. Basically, all of the distribution power, the buying power is effectively in the control of three houses, right? I mean, Glazers, Southern, right, Charmer, Sunbelt. I mean, these three companies control around 80% of the wine distribution. So if you're not in there, trying to find a small passion importer who wants to get behind you, they're there, but a major problem is they don't pay. And I think a lot of small producers in the room here, and I know quite a few of them, yeah, you get somebody and he loves my wine, but passion and money don't necessarily go together. And I do think that looking ahead 10 years from now, 15 years from now, an awful lot of you guys are going to be having your own, basically doing it yourself. You have to.
So you still have to go through a wholesaler, but you can bypass the distributors and go directly to the wholesaler. is what you're saying?
Well, it's
You can't go directly to a retailer, can you?
It depends on the state.
Right.
So we have 50 states. It's basically 50 different markets. So you can't really speak of, and then you throw Puerto Rico into the mix, which is its own thing, and D.C., which is a huge wine market. So, for example, if you're a retailer in D.C. or a restaurant, you can have an import license. And an import license, I believe, costs around $100. So I worked with a retailer in D.C. We had an import license, and the tax to bring a case of wine from anywhere in the world into D.C. to lay it in was, when I was there, was $1.10 a case. So that's how I wound up actually spending a lot of time in France, was going, because we could buy direct and then sell direct. So the prices were just incredibly cheap. But then you contrast that with, say, Ohio, the state of Ohio, which has mandatory markups, or Pennsylvania, which is run by the state, Utah, run by the state, Washington State. You have Virginia, where the alcohol is controlled by the state, but the wine is sold in stores. But the wine stores in Virginia cannot sell liquor. In New York, for example, wine stores, liquor stores cannot sell beer. It's not legal. Contrast that, in grocery stores, you can't buy wine or liquor. So every state has these very peculiar things. So, you know, if you look at the American market, you really have to look at it as 50 markets, 52 actually.
So could someone target an easy to access state, and then say target all of the restaurants in the major cities of that state and sell to them direct?
If they're willing to go there and present it themselves, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't, unfortunately, you can't count on a wholesaler to do that, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if you're in a big house that has, let's throw out South Court, or I don't even know what's called anymore, Treasury. Yeah, they're going to get the attention. The little guy, not so much. You have to do it yourself. I mean, I wish there was a shortcut, but no.
Okay, let's run through a few questions I've knocked up over the listening time of Jennifer, and also talking to you guys over dinner last night. So Jennifer, is Australia fully exploiting its competitive advantage? I probably should just throw in, and what is our competitive advantage?
There are so many opportunities. There's so many opportunities, and I think it's really identifying where you fit in, and that's going to be different for everyone. So I think, no, not exploiting their competitive advantage, because I think first it has to be identified, and there needs to be, like, this is a great opportunity for strategizing and trying to figure out, again, GSM, is that the way to go? It's mind-boggling, honestly. I think it's mind-boggling, the number of opportunities, and it's all tailored to certain markets, not physical markets, but also demographic markets. I mean, who do you want to go after? The younger people in their 20s coming in, you're right, they drink everything, and it's almost how you can't figure out, if you start adding up the numbers, how they must spend all day drinking all these things, because they're interested in so many things. They're not brand conscious, which is another advantage, because Australia has, I guess there's always a question of brand leaders, but I think what less well known can try to market themselves on, getting into one of these markets based on what they have to offer, what type of wine and what's popular among different segments of the market.
Well, Lisa, let me put the same question to you. What is our competitive advantage? You were waxing lyrically and very positive about our wines, but if someone actually went to America and wore out the shoe leather, as Josh thinks is a really important thing to do, when you get there, what do you say? What is your competitive advantage? We're good?
Well, first of all, I think you have to back it up a little bit and look at who you're competing against. If you're competing against New World, obviously if you're competing against a domestic market, California market, it's a little bit more difficult, because it's always going to be a nationalistic push towards a certain amount of wines there. But if you take that out of the equation and you look at the rest of the New World, what is your competitive advantage? And for me, looking at it as a wine critic, quality. You guys at the top end kick butt. You really do. When you look at other New World regions, I don't think any of them score as high and as consistently high as some of the Australian wines that are available. history. You guys have a pretty long history of winemaking that really, really needs to be told out there. You know, when you go back and you talk about things like James Busby clones, clonal material that's available here that's not even available in Europe anymore because it died out because of phylloxera. These are things that consumers at the high end, collectors, you know, at the premium end, really, really want to know about. You know, these are stories that they can tell when they put down their bottle of Australian wine, you know, next to a great Chateauneuf de Pape or a great Hermitage or even a great Bordeaux wine. And, you know, they're talking to their companions over a dinner table and they want to talk about this great Australian wine. These are the things that they want to be able to talk about. First of all, the high quality, the ageability. Oh my God, some of the Shirazes, you know, they will outlive many of the great Rhone wines out there. You know, it's incredible. And you know, the cellaring potential of some of the wines. But also, you know, quite simply the quality. It's there, you know.
Okay, let's imagine, Josh, that Lisa is absolutely right and everyone in the room agrees with everything.
I know I am.
Yeah. And we agree with you. That is a great story to tell. Are we if you agree, first of all, and then secondly, are we exploiting this competitive advantage as well as we should be?
Well, I think part of the problem is it's a question of education, and people will only be educated if they want to be. Okay, so you can't instill curiosity in a person, I don't think. I mean, it's either there or it's not. So the story is here, and the story has been here. I think one of the things that you're up against, especially in this situation in California, is that most Americans, I don't know what the percentage, I'm sure it's very high, virtually every American I know goes to California at least once a year. Same thing with New York. I mean, basically, if we go on vacation, where do you go? You go to California. Where do you go? San Francisco, which happens to be just a hop and a skip from Napa, Sonoma. And so you go to San Francisco for a week, you spend 4 days in the city, and a day up there. Los Angeles, you have Santa Barbara County. And so for people, I have a lot of friends in the stock market, lawyers, this and that, who know nothing about wine, but they go to the Napa Valley every year because it's close by San Francisco. It's a reason why if you go to Napa, you see these enormous resorts, spas. There's lots of corporate conferences there. So if you're a banker or if you're a lawyer, there's a good chance that once a year you're going to be at a conference close to Napa. And all you have to do is fly through San Francisco or Oakland, San Jose Airport, and it is staggering how many boxes of wine are getting checked in baggage that then's going off to Minnesota or Wisconsin or Missouri, wherever these people are from. So California is able to basically, virtually every American is an ambassador of California wine just by default. And plus the distribution is so potent. And I think that's what you guys are going to have to, you're going to have to compete with that. And the only way to do it is to go there.
Have you seen any company, Australian or whatever, that has actually communicated what their competitive advantage is really effectively? And if you can recall, what was that competitive advantage that they educated or communicated well to the US market?
I mean, the obvious one, of course. This is our Brooks. The obvious one would be the Casellas and Yellowtail. Yeah. The problem there, of course, is with that success and the it's everywhere, and it's inexpensive, and that becomes, in a way, sort of that's what creates the reputation. Champagne is probably the most brilliant marketing thing ever. Massive yields, age of vines, in fact, doesn't matter. Expensive as all get out, and if it stood on its own, say, okay, this is $60 a bottle, it's extremely high acid, this and that. Would it sell on its own, or sell because it's champagne? I'd really say that Yellowtail, for better or worse, is the success story, and it's actually one of the success stories in wine, period, not just Australian wine, at least in the U.S. I mean, the number of cases that they're making is mind-blowing.
But Lisa, I'll throw this to you as well. Is there an example of of a company that did have a quality offering that was able to get cut through with the market and tell their story effectively?
The best experience I've had recently with a company that has done this, and this is, going to the critics, I suppose, which is a great outlet because we speak directly to consumers, was, an opportunity I had to speak with Jane Ferrari recently about Yalumba's new Kaylee wine. And I just was completely in awe, not so much with the wine was good too, but with her storytelling ability. And I thought, wow, if everybody could get out and tell their story. She just done so much research, both into the history behind the wine that she was presenting, but also in the context of the people viewing it. So drawing in examples of Bordeaux, for example, examples that will be fresh in people's minds who are collecting wine, or if you're a sommelier and you're going to have to convey this story to a consumer in order to be able to sell the wine, giving this sort of context about a wine where, there was a history of Bordeaux with blending and Cabernet and not using Shiraz, but, well, if you're using a bit of Rhone wine to blend in there in the history, and how that features in the, overall complexity and the ageability of the wine and the stories behind the wine and everything like that. I think that these are the things, when we get to the premium sector, that need to be communicated to people, to give them the confidence to purchase, but also to feel proud about that purchase that they've made and be able to want to share it with other people.
Well, Josh, Australia used to sell quite a lot of high-end wine in the US. So what happened?
Again, I'd say it created a stereotype. I mean, the wines that got the attention. It's kind of interesting. In the early '80s, when I started to get into this, Australian wine was basically Hunter Valley, Coonawarra, and Margaret River. That was it. I mean, Barossa did. I mean, you had Penfolds, which is really sort of this overarching South Australia thing. But in what was it, '98, like really from '98 to 2002, the wines that were getting the big scores, the big reviews, were the big high octane, high alcohol, oaked, 16%, low acid, Barossa, South Australia, and the market was inundated with the wines. They got very high scores. They made an enormous impression on drinkers, the average person, and I think it was, in a lot of ways, the Australian wine industry is a victim of its own success. That those wines had such a presence that basically was at the expense of every other style. So people who, say, got into wine, and during that 4-year period, if their experience with Australian wine was probably going to be, Barossa, Shiraz, big things, and you say, well, what about Margaret River Cabernet? Like, what's that? I mean, that style dominated so much that we're still figuring out, I'm sure Lisa will speak to this too, for reviewing, people still have that in their mind that is Australian wine.
But why didn't we leverage off it? If it was obviously a golden period, why weren't we able to leverage off that?
Because tastes change, styles change. I mean, you hitch onto that train, well, eventually that train's going to stop, and people move on. For example, right now, not everything, but the big thing right now is Prosecco. So relatively low alcohol sparkling wine. The rosé trend is unbelievable. And sales every year is up like 35%. It's wild what's happening. How long is it going to last? It will definitely come to an end. All things do. So I think one of the problems that Australia had was becoming so associated with sort of like pretty much one style, one variety, one region, and everything else kind of suffered because people, they like to compartmentalize and look at one little thing and say that's it. It was a stereotype, and you deal in this like word association, this sort of stuff. Shiraz, still. If you say Riesling, they can't believe it. Like literally, it's just narrow thinking.
Jennifer, how important is the sommelier to Australia's development as a category?
Again, the sommelier, and not every restaurant has one, right? I mean, at high end, they're very important because they're telling these stories, and that's how they sell wine. And they, in the research that we've done with sommeliers, they really want those stories because otherwise they have nothing to say. They can talk about some of the boring stuff that consumers, will listen to, the technical stuff. But it's really the stories that grasp. Actually, so the one time I think I'll never forget, I was at a restaurant. It was a warm day. You're sitting outside, and we had a rosé at this French restaurant, and the waiter said, "It's just like a kiss." And I'm like, I've never forgotten that. That just how they can describe a wine that really hits the right spot. And that's where those stories are critical. You don't want them making it up. You wanted them to know your real story.
Of course, if anyone wants to ask questions at any point in time, just put your hand up. We've got 2 questioners around here, microphone carriers. So please put your hand up if you want to ask a question at any one time. Lisa, how can Australian wine establish, say, a healthy footing in grocery?
Healthy what?
A healthy footing,
In
a
grocery.
market share in, say, grocery in the USA.
In supermarkets. Yes, that's an interesting question. Again, it's a complicated question because not all states allow the sale of wine in grocery stores. So we're already, narrowed that down a bit. And it's where you want to be as well on that grocery store. So, if you're in Whole Foods, for example, which is a premium supermarket to begin with, and so just being on the shelf there is quite a big thing. And, being able to ask for a premium as well within that supermarket as opposed to something, that's much more lower end is probably an important place to be. So focusing on where you're going to be, understanding which states do allow it, and which supermarket group best suits the style of wine that you have is probably the more important factor. And then again, understanding your competition, who you're competing against, because traditionally, I hate to say it, but it's California wines that have dominated the supermarkets because they're so familiar to people in America. They know when they pick up a Napa Cabernet roughly what it's going to taste like and all of that. And coming back to a little bit of what Josh was saying, and that perception that people have of the big Australian Shiraz, well, I think that's okay. But the real work will be saying we're that and we're all of these other things too. So we still have that. And quite frankly, when we looked at the research, that we were seeing this trend for Americans consumers, particularly at the higher end, they do like the big, bold red wines. So that's not really the issue.
No. Actually, I have something I did not talk about that came out a lot in the trade research. That's a real barrier is that you walk into a retailer and all the Australian wine is together. So people walk to that section because they're probably looking for a Shiraz, and they might discover something else, but you don't have that opportunity to go to the Chardonnay section, which is usually in the domestic section, and say, oh gosh, I'll try this Australian Chardonnay because it's over with the Shiraz. So that's a real barrier, and that a lot of tradespeople have been frustrated by that because that's how shops are organized. And somehow, or there might be like a random white section where there'll be a lot of different things, but I don't know even how to tackle that, but it is a question that keeps coming up, or it's an issue that keeps coming up in the trade research.
Really, I think, and it comes down to, where you can convince a supermarket that they're going to have more sales opportunities for a wine.
Good point.
Because that's the way they think. Basically, will you be able to sell more wine, more Chardonnay, if you restructure it like this? And, you know, my simple answer would be yes, because obviously you're not going to sell that Australian Chardonnay when it's next to the Shirazes, and when people only go to the Australian section when they're looking for Shiraz, you know, so they don't even look at the Chardonnay there. They don't even look at the Riesling there. Move it over, basically, in with the other Chardonnays, you know, which is a greater domestic section, and maybe just section it out by varietal, really.
Question over here.
Yes, good morning. It's John Sholton from Brown Brothers Wines. Jennifer, thanks for an informative presentation this morning. I was interested in some of the conclusions you drew around New World or Southern Hemisphere wines being perceived as not serious, maybe quality not so great, and inexpensive, versus Old World wines. Northern Hemisphere is seen as the opposite. In one of the slides you put up with your bubble chart, New Zealand seemed to have bucked that trend to some extent. Any insights on that you could share?
Well, I think for New Zealand, it's all about their Sauvignon Blanc, right? I mean, that's really what is driving that is that success they've had in Sauvignon Blanc. But again, I think Americans think of New Zealand as just selling Sauvignon Blanc, so they're kind of stuck in that niche.
Sorry, what did you say? Americans think?
That the New Zealand Americans perceive New Zealand as just a producer of Sauvignon Blanc. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I think that's ultimately is going to be their demise.
Yeah.
Because it's a bit like it's basically monoculture. You know, ask the Irish. If that is your thing, it's going to happen with Argentina with Malbec.
Yeah, that's very good.
If the market loses its taste for Malbec, then Argentina's up, you know what creek,
Right.
Because their export, the percentage of, I think it's over 90% of American imports of Argentine wine are Malbec, and it's a similar situation with New Zealand and Sauvignon Blanc. If people move on, they're in trouble. You can't have monoculture. Everybody knows. Everybody here's a farmer. You know that.
I was really interested in one of the numbers on one of my own slides, that I think it was 38% of respondents had purchased Australian Sauvignon Blanc in the past 2 years, and I'm wondering if they're mixing that up with New
I was
Zealand.
thinking that when I saw that slide.
And it's like I have
I
no
was
way
like, really?
of knowing if they are or not, but that didn't make a lot of sense to me. So that's what they New World Sauvignon Blanc must be Argentina.
Well, and a lot of the shops in the U.S., including stores that really should know better, there is the Southern Hemisphere wine section.
Yes,
so
there is.
There's New Zealand, there's South Africa, and there's Australia, all jumbled in together, and usually it's way back in a corner by the bag-in-a-box stuff. I mean, it's just
Shouldn't
aggravating.
Argentina and Chile be there as well?
Well, this is the thing. I bet if you asked a lot of people, said Chile, they would say Malbec. When it's not.
Yeah, people
but it's
talk
just,
about South America, so
but
that
it's
they
next to
blend those two, Chile and Argentina, they blend, Australia, New Zealand.
Well, for example, we still have situations where, despite how much wine is being made in Oregon and in Washington, whereas the Pacific Northwest section,
Yes, there's a
and they're all
Pacific
jumbled in
Northwest.
together.
Yes.
So they have to be broken out.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got questions over here.
Hi, Lee Woodrow from Langmile. How you doing? First of all, Lisa, I would just like to thank you. About 2 years ago, I was living in Brisbane, and we had the wonderful Helen Masters from Atarangi was in Brisbane for the Pinot Palooza Festival. She received a phone call from the winery that you were popping over, and so she had to rush away to come and meet you. And so I got a phone call, said, Lee, would you mind covering my stand at Pinot Palooza? I said, yeah, no problem. And about a week later, a carton of 2012 Atarangi Pinot turned up on my door and sits beautifully in my cellar, so thank you for that. Now, my actual point. It's been a couple of points I've noticed. You've mentioned brand disloyalty. You've mentioned going direct to market. You've mentioned millennials increasing in wine buyers. You've mentioned the fact that there's certain areas where you can't do any advertising. I'm guessing that leads to a greater importance in social media. And so my question is, who do you think is the next big person that's going to break through the market? And Jennifer, you mentioned 96% of the growth is in minorities. Who is it going to be that talks to those people as that market grows and is able to spend money?
Tough question, isn't it?
I think the idea of an omnipotent critic, moving things. There was one, and we all know who he is or was. Social media has really, I don't want to say taken the guts out of that, but I'm sure you see in your research, like, who are your tastemakers? Usually it's your friends. And so, of course, people who spend a lot of time online, they're virtual friends and people that they trade email with that they've never met before. And so that, I think that's going to continue. And really, yeah, your biggest influence is your friends, people that you trust. And that means people that you're closer to. It's making it, I wouldn't say difficult for us, but I think that our trade, our guild is small and probably going to get smaller, I think, because of social media.
Lisa?
Yeah, no, I think there's a place for both. And obviously we do quite a bit with social media ourselves as well to talk about, what we do and what we're finding and all of this. The great thing about wine is it is a social thing. It's a community thing. People don't want to sit alone in a dark room drinking the bottle by themselves. I do sometimes, but you want to share the experience, whether you're there directly with your friends, having a great bottle of wine, or for your friends far away on the other side of the planet. Look, I'm connecting with these people and I'm having this bottle tonight, and that is a wonderful, wonderful. Powerful thing to tap into in terms of communication.
So our strategy should be to get the drinkers of the world, particularly in America, to always turn the bottle label around before they do a selfie. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
We
Okay.
do that anyway. I mean, wine dorks, we do that. You guys are all wine drinkers as well as producers and in the industry. It is so addictive as a culture to want to take a picture of your label, of your bottle, to share it on social media with your friends, to do the selfie with the bottle or with the winemaker even. And this is where you have the opportunity to take charge of social media as well. When you're out there, and I see some of the most effective wineries in terms of social media, posting pictures about them out in the market with their consumers, and sharing that with everybody. And people want to be a part of that. They want to be with you, the winemakers or the distributors, saying, oh, I'm drinking with so-and-so, and I've got this great bottle I've just discovered, or an older vintage even, of a fabulous wine. And that's highly addictive. And it's a great way of bringing our communication about wine to a whole other level.
Question over here.
Yeah, it's a very, very short question that we've asked the last 10 years, but I'd like each of the panellists to tell me screw cap or cork. And should Grange be under screw cap?
Josh?
Well, I mean, look, things don't happen overnight. I'd say that definitely the perception right now is far better than it was a year ago and better than last week. I see it on the rise, and definitely as a younger generation comes up that doesn't have the same preconceptions as my generation. Screw cap, I see it. It's future. The Portuguese don't like to hear that, but I'd say the perception is very positive, extremely positive, and it also helps when you have very important wineries in a given place, and no one's done it more than Australia. I mean, the fact that you can buy a Langmeal wine under a screw cap, that you can buy the top Penfolds wine under a screw cap, that's a validation to the consumer. They say, well, if they're doing it, it must be okay. Yeah. So I think screw cap, absolutely. I love them.
It's funny, you're talking about how millennials are disloyal drinkers. I've seen so many disloyal millennials at picnics in parks, and they've bought themselves a French bottle of wine with a cork, and none of them have got a corkscrew with them. They even know what a corkscrew is, I think, half these people. There's another question over here. Yeah.
Hi, James Hall from Magnum Wine Solutions. Fantastic panel session, really enjoying it. Just wanted to pick up on something you were talking about earlier to do with New Zealand and Sauvignon Blanc, Argentina and Malbec. And I just wondered your thoughts on, is there a risk that we put too much onto Shiraz from Australia, from the multiple regions that exist in Australia, and without sort of spreading the love across other varieties such as Cabernet blends, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay?
I think, yeah, as I said earlier, I think that's absolutely, it's a problem, is being associated with one thing. For example, right now, and Jennifer can probably speak to this more than I, but Chile, for example, I believe has effectively dodged the Argentinian bullet because, word association, you say Argentina, people say Malbec. If you say Chile, there are a lot of answers, even Pinot Noir now. Sauvignon Blancs from Casablanca, Syrah from Pinot Noir from the Biobío Valley, the Leda Valley. And so people are realizing that Chile is a lot of different regions, a lot of different grapes. But if you ask about Argentina, they're going to say Malbec and they're going to say Mendoza. And that's it. And I think with Australia, you have such diversity of varieties and regions. And I do think that is the key. So yeah, it's a huge problem if you are just that. I mean, look at McDonald's. Every year they're trying to figure out a way to not be a burger place. So it's salads, this and that, and they always fail. And it always goes back to being burgers and cheap burgers. And that's a problem. If people love to stereotype, it makes life easy. And so yeah, I think it has dodged it. But again, it's almost 20 years now since that Shiraz boom. And I do think that, yeah, in the U.S. at least, you're still living with that, for better or worse.
A question over there. We got a microphone over there.
G'day. Sorry, just I was actually had an answer first up for, is it John from Brown Brothers? He asked about why New Zealand were able to buck the trend on their price points, and it's no dissimilar. It's very similar, to what happened here in Australia with New Zealand as a category. When I was a retailer, which is a long time ago now, approximately 30 years, there were probably 3 or 4 New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs available in the marketplace. There was Cloudy Bay and 2 or 3 others, and they were all price pointed at a premium level. That's clearly not the case anymore as the race to the bottom happens with that category. You'll find the exact same thing happens in the US. They have sat in a really premium space in the marketplace for a long, long time, but that's actually now coming down a bit, and you'll probably see that go even further over the next few years. Just one other comment I was going to make on where we sit in whether it's grocery stores or Whole Foods or wherever else in the retail market. First of all, I'm sure most people in this room are probably aiming more at on-premise, but in the retail sector, and it is very scattered in the US, obviously being 50 different markets, but I have had some success with having discussions with retailers to formulate their stores a little bit differently. We do an Adelaide Hills Pinot Noir. I had a retail chain in Texas that wanted to bring the wine in because they particularly liked it, but we basically over a negotiation sat down and made a decision that it would have to sit in the domestic spot instead of sitting in the and getting lost in that area, because you're quite right. I think it was Josh, I can't remember who was saying that people walk into the Australian section to buy a bottle of Shiraz. They don't go there to buy a bottle of Pike's Riesling or a Pinot Noir. They go there for one particular variety. So it's a really worthwhile discussion having that. I try and get our Pike's Riesling, where possible, placed next to the Germans or the Austrian Rieslings or the Rieslings from the Finger Lake district or wherever. And we put dry on our label for the US market as well. So, but it is worth having that discussion with directly if you're there, or getting your distributors to have that discussion for you.
Yeah, thanks for the observations. Question in the back?
Yeah, hi guys. Question, I've just come back from the States. I was in California. A friend of mine works for Google over there, and he was just showing me through your marijuana laws are all about to change as of January. So I'm interested to hear from you guys what you think possibly the positive or negative effect that might have for the wine industry, and whether we'll see any sort of slop of sales. I mean, wine's an alcohol, marijuana's a drug. You sort of get the same buzz or hit. I don't know, but
you've heard about it. You've heard about it.
The big fella was telling me. So yeah, over to you guys.
It also seems to me if marijuana is going to take off the way some people think, a lot of wine producers should get into cookie making as well. All right.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to go there, because to me that is soon to be the big elephant in the room, and I think it's going to have a really, really strong effect, negative effect on lower end wines, because it's the whole pot thing. And people, for most people, the reason they're doing it is to get wasted, and so this would be like the equivalent of somebody who's doing shots, or the idea is that you're on a mission to get intoxicated. So I think that for somebody where basically that is the goal, if the marijuana stays cheap, of course the states are now taxing the hell out of it as they see the money opportunity. This is the whole reason that it is happening, is basically as tax revenue. And if you can get, mission accomplished, stoned, whatever, for $5, well, so I only have $5 to get hammered. Well, on wine, you're not going to get much wine for $5. You're not going to get a lot of beers. One hit of pot, done. And I think it's going to have a really, really a profound impact on inexpensive wine, inexpensive spirits. Any alcoholic beverage that's inexpensive is going to have to compete with marijuana, definitely over the next, for the foreseeable future. I think it's going to be a problem.
When the GFC hit, Time magazine, I think it was, had the best headline I've ever seen. They had photographs of George Bush, Hank Paulson, all the key people, and some of the big investment bankers. And the headline was, "What were they smoking?" And we know what they're going to be smoking in the future. It's going to be marijuana. And I was really intrigued to see what implication it has, not only for the industry, but just generally for the economy at large. Lisa, you have a view on that?
Yeah, no, I probably have the opposite view. I really don't think it's going to impact the wine market very much. I think we're talking about apples and oranges here.
But remember, Josh likes to sit in a dark room and get wasted. Light room as well.
I think, if you want to smoke pot, or you want to smoke cigarettes or whatever, you're going to. But I don't think it's going to change your mind. If you're looking for a wine experience, or you're looking for an alcohol experience, it's completely different. So or do both.
Jennifer, if you look at the research.
We have not done any research on this, and it came up recently, like, do we want to? I mean, I think we need to start asking the questions, absolutely, to kind of get at that. I mean, all we can really say is what we kind of perceive. I don't think people are going to start smoking pot instead of having a bottle of wine at dinner. I don't think it's going to affect some of the older generations, like my generation, who is committed. I'm in the committed generation. But the 20-year-olds, I think that's really a good question. I also have a kid in college who bought a bottle of wine for a special occasion and didn't have a wine opener, and they spent the whole evening trying to figure out how to open it up because they didn't have a screw cap. They should have had a screw cap. So I think both of these points are really interesting. I think it's going to surprise us. I can't wait to find out. But we do need to start asking questions.
Well, so I want to emphasize, I'm not talking about it affecting, let's call it the fine wine market. I'm talking about people who are on a mission.
And I think that's a great point. It's those people that are going to buy it lower.
Just something to get wasted. And that just adds another way. You can do it with booze, you can do it with beer, you can do it with wine. Now you can legally do it with pot. I mean, pot's always been there, of course. And now, of course, though, it's more acceptable. And by the way, most of it in the U.S. it's not smoked. It's edible.
It's edible, yeah. And so that's another thing. If you think about wine and food, that's not going to affect the fine dining. But, and again, I don't know, how much is it going to be?
Well, the sale of Doritos is going to go through the roof.
Absolutely.
So I'd start investing in Frito-Lay tomorrow. But yeah, I just think that if you look at it as an intoxicant, and there is a major part of the population of people who drink alcohol are doing it to get drunk. And that's the idea, just to get pissed. And so you throw pot in the equation, it's going to take away from the pie from the other intoxicants. But as far as fine wine, I don't think it'll affect it at all. I agree completely with Lisa.
All right, guys, just imagine there are some people in the room who have been pretty impressed with what you've said, which of course everyone would be in the room thinking that. And so someone comes to you, Lisa, and says, okay, what is the biggest opportunity you see for Australian wine brands in the US? They want you to tell them the opportunity that they can exploit so they succeed, and you can't make a mistake, all right? You have to get this right.
What's the biggest opportunity in the U.S. For wine brands? I think it has to be really at the higher end, at the collectible end, because this is, again, one of the unique advantages that I see from Australia, is the absolute intrinsic quality caliber of wines that can be produced. And I'm not just talking about Shiraz, because, you know, like one of my bar none, you know, favorite Chardonnays of all time comes from Australia as well. So, but I think it needs to be the quality card that can be played here. And it not just quality, but also the unique signature of Australian wines. How it is something, a taste of a place and a winemaker's vision that you cannot get anywhere else in the world. And this is, you know, what collectors are really looking for and what they don't understand about Australia now. And to be able to effectively go to somebody and, you know, have that epiphany moment with either a consumer or a gatekeeper, here is something that's truly unique and collectible that nobody else knows about right now. And, you know, you have an opportunity to sell it. You know, this is going to be the next great thing. And that's where the real opportunity lies, because that message has still not got across to the vast majority of Americans.
Jay? Oh, so Josh, sorry, Josh.
One thing we haven't touched on, but it relates very much to one of your slides about the shifting demographic in the U.S. The future, I think, not the future, the present is brighter, fresher, lighter wines. The American palate, actually the world palate, has taken this massive shift towards Asia, and at least in the U.S. also the Hispanic population. And so you can go to a grocery store in Wichita, Kansas, and there's a sushi counter. Okay, I mean, basically every town in America has a Thai place, an Indian place, ethnic foods. Used to be lemons in the supermarket were cheap and massive. Lemons are more expensive than limes now. It's hard to find limes. Cilantro, there was parsley. There was no cilantro. You go to a store now, a grocery store again in Missouri, and there are 10 kinds of chili peppers. And I believe that a generation that grows up eating those things is going to demand wine, beverages, things that fit a similar profile. And I would just point to, for example, Corona beer about 12 years ago passed Heineken. It used to be, you'd say beer, and you'd say Europe. Now you say beer, and it's say Mexico. Look at the rise of gin, tequila, plata, silver tequila. It's brighter, fresher, citrus, things like that. Go to the butter section. The butter section has shrunk. The milk section has shrunk. If you look at sodas, all the soda companies now are in the water business. So you have a whole generation that doesn't drink and eat the way my generation did or my parents' generation. And they want fresher, brighter. They're more health conscious. They're also into sustainability, these kinds of things that nobody talked about 20 years ago. And now it's it. And I think it's going to stay that way for a long time.
Jennifer?
A couple things. I think the food thing is key. I think that Australia's got that, right? You have ethnic. You've got every cuisine. You've got a wine to go with each one of them, right? So that you have that whole palette to work from. I just forgot what I was going to say. It's really important.
Okay, we'll let you come back. Put your hand up when you remember it. But look, looking at your snapshot of us, things that stood out for me was Crocodile Dundee. So Americans still identify us with Crocodile Dundee.
Of a certain generation, right? If everybody, the younger generation associates you with Nemo getting home, right?
Oh.
Yeah. So that changes with generation also. I think that I don't think my kids know who Crocodile Dundee is.
Yeah, but I guess the older drinker who's in that high end might recall that film. Do we need to bring Paul Hogan back as an older man drinking the best of Australian wine rather than throwing prawns on the barbecue, or sorry, shrimps on the barbecue? That he's drinking wine.
I think a lot of the younger generation, you have a clean palate, you know, that they don't have these perceptions of Australia the way that the baby boomers do. And the other, I remember now, so this is what I'm going to say about the younger generation. They don't drink the same thing. They don't, you know, you talk about people in the baby boomer generation, older, I think that the older baby boomer generation, that were brand conscious. Like my aunt is a Rombauer Chardonnay drinker, period. I mean, she just came to a party and said, you know what, there's this wine I found. It's really interesting. It's called Sauvignon Blanc. I'm like, really? You know, people, they're really brand conscious. And the younger generation isn't. They want to taste different things. They don't want to be stuck. And I think that's another advantage Australia has, is that you have so many wines to offer that generation that wants to try different things. They don't want to stick to one thing.
This is a question that I guess some people might be thinking. How is the lowest global vintage since 1961 going to play out in the market? Lisa?
That's a good question. I suppose, you know, for us in particular, because we tend to deal with the fine wine market, our consumers, well, they are engaged because they're willing to pay $100 a year to subscribe to us, to know our buying decisions. Wine is, you know, at the higher end about supply and demand. And when there's less supply, demand is, you know, equal or more, and the price goes up. So it's going to be interesting, actually, because you're right. I mean, we've you know, had so many catastrophes around the planet this vintage that have really lowered the crop, you know, particularly coming out of Europe. But now we've had, you know, what's just happened in Napa and Sonoma as well. And this is a huge impact on the U.S. market in particular. And, you know, this is probably a blessing in disguise for Australia, because, you know, you guys have an opportunity to sort of get in there where, you know, there's going to be higher prices, less wines available from a lot of fine wine regions around the world. You've got fine wines. And, you know, you've got the availability there, you know, and it's a good time to sort of get in there and just say, look, what about this? You know, you can't get that. That's too expensive now. What about this?
Josh, if someone wants to go over there, and as I say, you said to me last night that there's no substitute to actually getting over there and wearing out the shoe leather. And I said to you, okay, you get the great interview opportunity. What does the story have to be? Because it's all very well having a story, but we want you to give us the story that has a 100% chance of success. That's all.
If I could do that, I wouldn't be sitting here.
Don't say that. We thought you were such a philanthropic sort of guy.
I do think that it's uniqueness. And I think, especially at the high end, I think that's where the greatest opportunity is, regardless of where you're from. Uniqueness, things are of a place, and you keep sort of circling back to this thing about storytelling. You have to go do it. You can't expect somebody else to do it for you, because you'll be probably sorely disappointed. Do it yourself. I mean, you guys all have, as producers, you have a unique story. There's something that makes you different from your neighbor. You have to go share it. So it's uniqueness, place, tell the story about your winery. Hopefully it's true, most of it, but yeah, just there's absolutely no substitute for getting right in front of people and ultimately getting the wine in the glass and getting people to drink it. But it's very difficult to make people curious. They have to be curious on their own. Otherwise, they'll just tune you out. But I've been really pleased over the last couple of years to see how many Aussies have actually come to the U.S. And I mean, I see some of the people in this room, I see 3-4 times a year in the U.S., which is incredible. Because 10 years ago, it didn't happen. It was really rare. And I think you guys, you get it. You understand that there is no substitute for that. So you got to get on the plane and you got to go there and tell your story. Otherwise, it's not going to get out. Simple as that.
Lisa, what brands, regions, or country stories are resonating in the US market nowadays, and why do you think?
Brand, region, or
For example, the Kiwis got it some time ago with Sauvignon Blanc. They obviously kicked a big goal then. But is there anything of late that you're seeing stand out? I'll ask you the same
I mean, in the mid-market, it's Prosecco, Rosé,
Yeah, good point.
and red blends,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, rosé is continuing.
Rosé is huge.
Yeah.
And
The only reason I sort of gave rosé a chance because I grew up when Matus rosé was the only rosé, and people bought it primarily to put a candle in at the end and melt the candle on the side. It didn't taste very good. But when I went to the south of France, around Saint-Tropez, all of a sudden I saw really sophisticated people drinking this lolly water called rosé, and it was very nice. It really suited the climate and whatever. So how did they get that kind of opening in the USA, do you think? Was it from overseas holidaying or?
No, I think it's just, I think it's just changing tastes and trends.
And understanding that rosé doesn't have to be sweet, because
Yes.
we've got the white Zinfandel issue. White Zinfandel sales are going down. Dry rosé is the hot thing, and it's a wonderful wine. It goes with everything. You can choose them, and it's hard to pick a bad one for the mid-range. It's affordable. It comes from many countries. It's easy. It's easy.
It used to be a seasonal thing. It used to be just in the summer, and now people are wanting it all year round, basically.
Well, I'd say that it goes hand in hand with what I was talking about earlier about shifting demographics, shifting palate. I'd say Prosecco, Rosé. So Prosecco, about 10 and 11% alcohol. The Rosés, and by the way, the Rosé that sells is the really pale stuff. So the Sanier Rosé is basically dead. You walk in a store, there's very little Sanier wine. You still can't really sell Tavel very well. So rich Rosés are like this. And it's just, again, lighter, brighter, fresher. And so rosé fits right in with gin and lighter beers, higher acid citrus fruits, this and that. It's just part of a shift in the palate, and it's worldwide. It's not just the U.S.
I guess the last question, harking back to the question earlier in the day about distributors, how do Australian producers get in front of distributors, and what do they tell them to basically select them and start distributing their product?
I think ultimately I think it's a dead end. Because as we know now, basically, as I said earlier, I think it's 3 companies control almost 80% of the distribution. So I think you're going to have to do it yourself.
Yeah.
And just almost forget doing that, getting in front of them, because their phones ring off the hook. So I live in New York, and a number of the wholesalers there, they say it's staggering how many requests they get from producers, importers, can I please come see you? And they just basically say no. They have too much. And so that means you're left out in the cold, which means you got to do it yourself. Figure out a way to do it yourself.
Lisa?
Well, I used to be a wine salesman in the UK for quite a few years after the wine bar job. And I got to say, wine salesmen, they're pretty lazy. And they want an easy job of it. And the easiest job is when you've got a ready-made consumer. Somebody's asking you for the wine, and all you do is take the order. And this is where I think that, if Australia really wants to get an angle, they work on the pull effect. You get out there, you talk to consumers, you talk to sommeliers, you talk to, critics, people who are going to actually listen to your story and retell your story. And then you will have distributors asking for your wines because there's a pull effect. Consumers going into retailers saying, do you know where I can get a bottle of this? Or a consumer going into a restaurant saying, I've heard about this wine, I really want to try it. Do you have that on your list? You get enough consumers asking for your wine, you've already done the job for the distributor. You've made it easy for them. They can be as lazy as they want.
I think that's a really good point. What the trade when you ask the trade, and I ask them a lot, what can a country do, what can a region do promotionally to really make a difference? And they all want tasting. They want to taste it. The consumer wants to taste it. They want their staff to taste it. They want the wine in front of once people taste it, they understand what high quality wine is. And so I think that getting the wine to them, like you said, is the easiest thing. And also what I learned in this last round of research is people aren't walking in asking for Australian wines. They might come in and ask for a Shiraz, but they don't come in asking for Australian wine. So you need to get them to come in and say, hey, I want to try Australian wines. And that may be, again, not focusing on one grape or one type of wine, but to get that brand of Australia out there.
A question over here.
This is a question for Josh, really, but Lisa kind of answered it, so thank you. Affordability for entering the market in America, the idea of selling wine to America and then selling it yourself is an expensive exercise to do. And what I noticed is if you go in once, it really doesn't do the job, so you've got to keep repeating and going and seeing the same people. So that affordability. But tactically, what do you think is the best way for a brand to enter the market in the US in terms of concentration of selling?
Well, we are definitely stuck with the multi-tiered system. So I forget who had mentioned earlier, you really have to figure out where you want to be and then learn to basically work with those laws. That's the beginning. I mean, I say you self-distribute this and that. There are regulations on where you can have a license. Some states it's allowed. For example, we have a major problem going on right now with shipping, big time, with retailers that are being restricted because, again, the big wholesalers have effectively shut down. They're suing UPS, FedEx, and so basically FedEx and UPS are saying, like, we're not going to ship because we don't want to get in trouble. So in a lot of ways, the options are shrinking, which again creates an opening for you guys. But I think I'll go back. I think you have to do it yourself because if you go and say, "Oh, I'm going to ring up Glazers in Texas or Southern Wine and Spirits in Nevada," get in line. There are about 200 people ahead of you trying to do exactly the same thing.
But Josh, what do you mean when you have to do it yourself? If you have to work with a three-tier system, what do you mean?
Find out the laws of a given state, a given market. Actually, take advantage of the expertise of Mr. Ridgway here, and say, okay, if I want to sell in California, how do I do it? And there are states that are friendly to basically setting up your own company. I mean, literally, sometimes you need a physical address, you need a warehouse. You're probably going to have to hire somebody. I mean, it takes some money, and it takes time, but I think that the payoff in the long run, the dividend is worth it. But you'll have to find a partner, a wholesale partner, an import partner. A lot of times, again, different states. Total Beverage is a big chain around the country, but they have to adapt to different states. So, for example, in New York, as a retailer, you can only have one license under your name. So, and Total is now coming in, and they're going to do what they do in every state. They're going to sue the state and say that is, restraint of trade, this and that, and the other thing. That's just New York. Other states have as many as you want. Have 50 stores. So Texas, for example, does that. Illinois does that. California, so you can have chains. Certain states don't allow it. So I think you really need to look at it as 52 different markets and just decide if it's worth it, if it's worth the effort, worth the expense.
What about online purchases of wine in the USA? For example, is Amazon flogging wine? And are Americans, this is probably a question for you, Jennifer, are Americans going online and buying a case of wine from Australia or Chile or Argentina?
I mean,
is there an opportunity there?
Online is gaining ground, especially younger people don't go shopping. They don't go they have their groceries delivered. I was very surprised to talk to younger people who, I mean, they buy everything online. It's increasing. It's just shipping is expensive. Shipping is expensive.
And being heavily regulated. I mean, this is as we speak. I mean, this is going on. And what is again? These big wholesalers have said they saw the increase in online sales, and so fantastic. You can go online. You go to a website for a shop in California, for example. I know very few retailers in California today who will ship to New York. So you can buy it, but it's like, how do you get it?
Yeah.
And as far as the Amazon thing is very interesting because Amazon bought Whole Foods. And they were doing wine distribution online, and then they stopped. And everybody said, oh, they decided not to. He said, no, it's because they bought Whole Foods. And that basically means that they are now the owner with Whole Foods of hundreds of licenses. So, yeah, they don't need to worry about that anymore. They're going to do it through Whole Foods. So I think you're only seeing the beginning of what Amazon's going to do. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be good for small producers. I really don't think it's going to be good. limited options.
Lisa, how did the partnership with the Michelin Guide come about? And is food the future for fine wine, that link between the two?
Oh, well, that's a long story, but I'll cut to the chase. Earlier this year in July, we announced a 40% stake that Michelin had taken into Robert Parker Wine Advocate. So yes, we are partnering with them, mainly in terms of events that we're doing. Much more so, we want to be able to create experiences with our subscriber base, with potential subscribers, in terms of not just wine, but wine and food, which opens up a much larger market. And as you probably aware, wine, even at the lower end, but especially at the higher end, is pretty niche market. Food, however, is incredibly mass market, and there's been a global trend towards fine dining. I mean, you've seen that here in Australia, probably some of the most passionate foodies in the world. So for us, it seemed like a natural step to take to be able to not just talk about wine, but to show what wine is, and to be able to tell those stories about wine. And, from our experience, we've been doing wine events now for the last 5 or 6 years, and we've just had so much success. So many consumers really want to come and understand wine at the higher level, be able to experience it in the context of other wines, listen to experts as well as winemakers talk about the wines. And, I think creating experiences is the next level as we move away from, I hate to say it, in my day when I started out drinking wine, it was a real experience to walk into a retailer and be able to speak to, the retailer about wines and, maybe do a little tasting and things like that. As we move into the modern era and we get away from that one-on-one contact, people going much more online. And, it is happening a lot in the States. People are less and less going into a wine shop and more going online to do their fine wine purchases or doing direct to consumer when it comes to mailing lists and things like that. So, being able to go to a third party, who's creating this incredible wine and food experience just seemed like the natural next step.
Okay. Question over there.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dean Hewitson from Hewitson. On my frequent travels to the States, it really comes across to me that we lack that regional identity where no-one simply is, oh, you're from Australia. And referring to the information with the sophistication, for example, that France and California have. I mean, everyone refers to Bordeaux, Napa Valley, simply Australia, lacks sophistication. Should Wine Australia be taking the bit between the teeth now and actually really focusing, drilling in on regionality? Will that help our sophistication ultimately make it easier to sell wine in the States and increase price points?
I think regionality is important, and educating about regionality is important, but I think you also have to, there's a fine line. Americans aren't terribly bright in the sense that, that's a lot of information.
This is being videotaped, Jennifer. Can we edit that one out?
No, we have short attention spans, and so there's a fine line between too much information about regionality, and so I think that's where the balance, and that's where the experts at Wine Australia will be able to help figure out how to educate about all Australia has to offer regionally, but not overwhelm, and that's a challenge, because you don't want people just to say, oh, forget it, it's too complicated. I think that's happened, for not the high end, but in the mid end. There was always talk about France is too complicated, Germany is too complicated. Americans like to see the varietal on the label. And I think that's an extreme, but how do you market regionality without being confusing?
Can I ask this? I guess we're getting close to the last question, but do you think that there's some kind of angle that we can play up that our climate is actually a very good climate for growing wine, growing grapes? Because people think, as you made the point, Jennifer, that we're basically a desert, with a few cities thrown in. But and I've got to say, as an Australian, I was quite surprised that that South Australia in particular, climatically, is a very good climate for growing wine. And most people don't understand that. They think wine has to come from Europe, where it's colder and greener and rainier. Is this a story that needs to get out?
Oh yeah, I mean for sure. But it's a little bit of leading a horse to water and making it drink. People have to be curious about it. They have to be willing to listen. Otherwise, it's static to them. And if you can't make people curious, I mean, you can teach them things, but they have to be receptive to it in the first place. And I don't think there is an answer to that. And I completely agree with what you're saying. But right now, I think our country is in the middle of a serious ADD crisis. And media and these kinds of things, these distractions don't help. The Twitter thing, 180 characters, this kind of stuff.
What we need is fake news, really, don't we?
Oh yeah. Fake news works. We know that.
Okay, question at the back.
Josh, just coming back to your bit about, which I think is pretty scary at the moment, the consolidation of business distribution in America. I think it's happening globally, not just in America. We all love selling wine there. It's getting harder and harder, but I look at the flip side of it. It's actually become really interesting and exciting for many of us that are, as you say, going in different ways, whether we're going to big retail, to brokers, whether we're focusing on 3 or 4 states, whether we use normal imports. With all that mix happening, there's a lot of noise happening, and I'm wondering whether all this sort of going around the normal 3-tier distribution has been caused by this consolidation. If this consolidation continues, can you see at one point in the next 5, 10, 20 years that your 3-tier distribution model, or your way of which we are meant to bring it into America, completely drops and you become an open market and we don't need importers?
It's not going to happen. They're too big. There's too much money involved. They represent big wineries. I mean, if you are a Robert Mondavi, you love the 3-tier system, because that means you have a wholesale house in all 50 states with the sales force out doing the work. There's a very high-quality producer in Sonoma Valley named Rocchioli, and I tasted with him, Tom Rocchioli, a number of years ago, and I said, why do you work with Terlato? Which is actually was a big company. They used to be called Paterno. I said, why do you work with them? He said, because they're in all 50 states, and I have one client, them. And they get to take care of all the dirty work, getting out on the street, this and that. So he said, if I'm going to be in 50 states working direct, then I have 50 clients I have to chase for money, people coming around, bothering him. He said, it's just basically chase one person to take care of all the details. And when you have houses, distribution houses that are filled with these types of producers, there's really not much room for a little guy, okay? I mean, because it's, money talks. And and the attention of these big houses is devoted squarely on those producers. And in many cases, the producers actually own the houses. So good luck getting in there. I do not see it going away. If anything, I see it getting worse. Just more and more consolidation. There's a lot of rumors right now about a couple of the big mergers that are about to happen. I'm sure it's going to happen again. It's going to get smaller in terms of available clients for you to sell to. It's ugly. It's really ugly. Sorry.
No. Yeah, we would prefer a much happier scenario, but I guess truth must prevail in an era of fake news. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panellists. It was very interesting.